Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is Chris, aka the Bearded Blofeld with the Bond Report. We're gonna get right into it today. I am joined by someone super special. I'm so excited to have her here. She is the lecturer of creative writing at the University of Edinburgh. You guys know her as the author of the next James Bond trilogy series. Please welcome Kim Sherwood.
Hi, thanks so much for having me and for that very nice introduction.
Absolutely. I've looked forward to this for weeks and weeks and weeks.
Oh,
So happy to have you here.
Thank you.
No problem. So, it's you.
It's me.
And I say that because I feel like that's what the Fleming estate said when they were looking for the next author, because that's a challenge. I can't imagine taking on that task, being in their shoes and sitting back going, who's going to write the next adventure for the biggest franchise in entertainment history? You kind of hold all the keys to the castle, or the Aston Martin. Should I say the Aston Martin? So how has that been over these past 8 months or so? Actually longer than that, really, because you've known and been doing this for what, 3-4 years now?
So I first had the tap on the shoulder in December 2019, and I was told by the Fleming estate that I was a rare beast. They'd been looking for a while for an author to take on the books because Anthony Horowitz's tenure was coming to an end, and they wanted somebody who was a real fan of the books. That passion is really important to them because, of course, this is their family legacy. So they want whoever takes it on to really care. And they looked at a few different writers, and I don't know who, but I'm sure all amazing writers. But for whatever reason, it just hadn't quite clicked. And my agent heard this and knew that this was like my dream job. And she sent them actually a tweet I'd posted when my first novel, Testament, came out. I'd tweeted a picture of it in a bookshop next to Anthony Horowitz's Bond book, and I'd said something like, "Oh, one step closer to my dream of writing Bond." And she found that and screenshot it and sent it to them and said, "Maybe this is the writer for you." And it did feel like a moment where everything kind of fell into place and everything clicked together. And I just felt incredibly lucky to have everything kind of fall into place at once, and to be in the right place at the right time, and that they like my ideas, and to get to step into this world, as you say, it's to have the keys to the Aston Martin. I wish, but it feels like an enormous privilege. And
guys, just a heads up, everybody watching at home, we're gonna have timestamps down below, so that way if you want to come back to this video and watch it later, we'll have those timestamps in the description below as well. I've heard you kind of describe this entrance into the franchise throughout various other interviews and things. So I don't want to lay on this too long, but I did want to, talk about a little bit about you, because obviously you've been a fan for quite some time. GoldenEye was your first. Was that what hooked you?
Well, it was seeing Pierce Brosnan's films on the TV, and really it was two moments. It was GoldenEye and The World Is Not Enough. It was the spectacle of both of them. So obviously GoldenEye, diving off the dam, the grandeur of that, the scale of that completely caught my imagination. And then there was a smaller moment in The World Is Not Enough, which isn't kind of as a famous a moment, but for me, I remember really vividly coming into the living room, and The World Is Not Enough was just on TV. And it was the moment where he falls down the Millennium Dome and he hits the ground, and then it goes into the credit sequence. But he stands up and he rolls his shoulders and he keeps on walking. And I remember just standing in the middle of the living room rug, just staring at the screen, completely transfixed, because he was a hero who could fall off the Millennium Dome, which was a massive deal when I was young, because they spent years building it, and it ran over budget, and it was always in the news. And he did hurt himself. That was obvious. He'd hurt himself because he rolls his shoulders, but he keeps on walking. And that was what grabbed me about him as a hero. And I ran upstairs and I grabbed my magnifying glass and my notebook, and I immediately started to play Spies. And that for me was, I think, a really fundamental moment, not only in my love of James Bond, but in my development as a writer, because I would, as playing Spies and playing James Bond, I would make notes about all the things I was observing about the people around me. And I would spy on my neighbors, who were very tolerant, luckily. And I would, weave together all these narratives, usually murder plots, between all my neighbors. So I think my love of James Bond really coincided with my desire to be a writer. And that's why just particularly that moment, watching him fall off the Millennium Dome, I think is so kind of seared in my memory. And they've always been so good at that, at using the icons of a city or using
Yes.
the icons of a landscape and drawing them in. And I think it's John Glenn in one of the special features on the DVDs, he talks about how they would always try and bring it into the story. It's not just the Thames for the Thames sake or the Millennium Dome for the Millennium Dome's sake. It's let's bring it into the story and make it important. And I think they've always been so good at that in their sequence design and in their stunts, that they really integrate these things that might otherwise seem kind of too fantastical. They integrate them into our world because they weave them into our cities and they weave them into our monuments. And there's also something there, I think, about how monumental James Bond is. You know, that even something like the Millennium Dome or the Eiffel Tower or whatever it is, Golden Gate Bridge, can't stop him. You know, he's a bigger monument than all of those things rolled together.
I think that's what helps connect people generation after generation after generation to this character, is that you have all of these real world elements, as opposed to you step into other franchises, Star Wars, Star Trek, you know, Marvel, and they don't connect the same way because they don't have those featured elements as major key players in the films.
Absolutely. And so, that, you know, that's, I think you're completely right. And James Bond does feel part of our world in a way that very few franchises do. You know, we treat him like a real person. I was in Spain doing publicity for Double or Nothing coming out there, and they asked me on the radio, what do you think James Bond would think of Brexit? And I just loved it as a question because it just so underlines how we think of him as a real person, as if he was like in the radio studio with me, and I could just turn to him and say, I don't know, James, what do you think of Brexit? You know, we could just have a chat about it.
Yeah, so I got a question for you.
Like, exactly. If you're not busy.
Right, exactly. I think that's a big connection point, is, you know, he's been around for so long, and I think that's, I'm not going to dwell on this too long. I think that was a big heartache and shock with No Time to Die. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen No Time to Die, but sorry, it's been a couple years. I don't feel bad for you at this point. Get your life together. But, you know, he dies in that film. And so that we have to now consider that canon and say, okay, any film that comes after this is a prequel to No Time to Die.
Oh, that's such an interesting way to think about it. And time in James Bond is such a wibbly wobbly concept, technical term.
It was for a long time until No Time to Die happened.
But then, because what interests me about it is that pre-Daniel Craig in the films, it was like time was suspended, or Bond existed in some kind of fairy tale dimension where he seemed to have his former incarnation's memories, but wasn't them. And we all just suspended our disbelief and we went along with that. And then with Casino Royale, watching him become a 00, time is suddenly introduced, and then they maintain that through the Daniel Craig series. You have him bleeding, they mention him aging, although obviously it's Daniel Craig and he doesn't age, so I mean that's just unrealistic. But he's going through this process of mortality and vulnerability until the ending. And I'll be really curious to see what happens in the future, what kind of role time plays. Now it's been introduced into the series. As you say, can you remove it, or is it there forever now? I don't know the answer. I'm just, as a fan, intrigued to see what happens.
Yep. I'm right there with you. I think we all are, and you know, that's an anticipation. And I feel like that's a whole other conversation we could go down a rabbit hole on. But you know, again, kind of back to you for a second here. Obviously, author of Testament, Double or Nothing. You just released, like, what, 3-4 weeks ago, if that? Not even 4 weeks ago. A Wild and True Relation. Huge accomplishment there. 14 years in the making. 14 years, Kim. That's incredible. That's, talk about dedication.
Thank you. That's very kind. Yeah, it was supposed to be my first book, and that was the plan. And then you know, things happened, life happened, and I wrote Testament really in response to grief and losing my grandfather. But A Wild and True Relation always stayed with me. There were points where I thought I might have to let it go, where maybe I was closed out of the story, but it always brought me back in. So finishing that and bringing it out feels like such a completion of a journey. That's one of the great joys of the 00 series, knowing I've got more than one book. because I you always keep thinking about your characters. And so it's been such a joy knowing I've got the space, I've got a very long runway to take them down.
Kind of a warm-up question, if you will. And I know we've kind of been talking a little bit back and forth, but with The Spy Who Loved Me, you've said is your favorite book. Is that correct?
One of. Well,
Okay.
Probably my all-time favorite book is From Russia with Love, but The Spy Who Loved Me, I think, is probably in my top 3.
It's so
Which might
hard to
surprise
pick one.
people because it's so hard, isn't it? But yeah, being one of my favorites might surprise people because it's an unconventional Bond novel. And for those who haven't read the novels, it bears zero resemblance to the film, apart from the title. It's the only Bond novel written in first person, and it's from the perspective of the woman, the main female character. And it has this very unusual structure where Bond doesn't turn up until 2/3 of the way through the book. And that's something that I love about Ian Fleming's writing, how daring he is structurally and formally, book to book. And that's not something that we maybe talk about much or think about much, because they might follow the same kind of plot structure: receive mission, go on mission, pick up allies, meet villain, all of these things. But how he actually arranges that in the novel really differs book to book. And I love when he's experimental and when he looks at Bond from the outside. And of course, I found that really inspiring with Double or Nothing, where I have this ensemble cast of characters who are looking at Bond from the outside.
I don't feel like you could have come in and had this conversation at any better time, because here we are talking about, we've got one of your favorite books from the perspective of a female. We've got a major female lead character in Double or Nothing. Mm-hmm. You're a female author yourself. And here we are in Women's History Month 2023 at the time of filming. So when you're watching this at home, it may be different, but that's when we're sitting here today. And I couldn't think of a better time to bring you in, because I feel like you are a part of women's history at this point, being the first female author to join the boys club for James Bond. Let's be real.
Thank you. I feel very proud to join a line of women who've been involved in Bond for so many decades, but maybe haven't been so visible. So as you say, on the face of it, it certainly seems kind of like the Old Boys Network, which I reference in the book, with M's character belonging perhaps to, this is my version of M, belonging to a kind of more traditional kind of Old Boys Network generation. But I thought a lot about that. I thought a lot about the role of women in the world of Bond, both kind of behind the camera and on the page, going back to Johanna Harwood, who co-wrote the real life Johanna Harwood, who co-wrote the first 2 Bond films, and who
well, let's stop there for a second. Yeah, we got to talk about the real Johanna Harwood here, because I love the fact that you used a real world person as the character name. So kind of go into that for just a second, if you will.
Well, so I wanted to find a way to really directly thank that generation of women, because if it wasn't for women like Johanna Harwood across the arts, I wouldn't get to do what I get to do now, because they broke so many barriers, and they often did it invisibly or without the praise or credit they were due. And I feel this very personally, because my grandmother was a set and costume designer on film. And she actually worked on films that won Oscars like Moulin Rouge, but she was never credited as the top figure, although she was the head of her department. They gave the credit to men. And that was very typical of that era. But if it wasn't for women like my grandmother or like Johanna Harwood, who persevered in the face of that, then I wouldn't get to be the new author of Bond, because they led the way. So I wanted to find some way just to say thank you, really. And I had this idea of having this new 003 and naming her after Johanna Harwood. So I wrote to the real life Johanna Harwood, and I just sent her a letter and said, writing this book, and I would really love to honor you, and here are my reasons, and I promise to give your name to a good character, and would you mind? And she was very, very kind about it, and we've since become pen pals, which is such a surreal sentence, and really one of the greatest honors of my life, to be pen pals with the real Johanna Harwood.
That's amazing. So writing her in, Joanna Hardwood will be the janitor of MI6. No,
That'd be awful,
no.
wouldn't it? The secondary role.
Yeah.
Um,
No,
so yes, I took a few real names here and there, and then there are Easter eggs that fans will recognize as well. So Bob Simmons is the lift man. There are a few things like that as well, which I wanted to kind of pay homage to the history of the franchise, and also just put in things that make me smile and hopefully make other Bond fans smile, even if maybe to a wider readership it doesn't mean much.
so I feel like stepping out of the normal James Bond adventure, and you've actually kind of stated it as like sidestepping Bond, if you will, you kind of run into this really cool element of a Bond novel that no one else has tapped into or been able to tap into, I should say. And I'm going to compare it to Star Wars, because years ago, one of the directors of Star Wars came out. It wasn't George Lucas, it was one of the secondary ones. But he actually came out and said, you cannot put Darth Vader on screen too much. Because if you do, he loses his fear factor.
Yeah.
So using him less is actually way more impactful on not only the character, but also the fear element of him. And I feel like that is the element of Bond in this novel, because he is brought up. There are conversations with him. So I don't want everybody at home think he's just completely, totally gone and absent. No, he's in the book. Calm down. Using him so much less, I felt like as soon as I got to those moments with him, I was like super intent on like, oh my God, there he is. And it became more impactful. Now, was that intentional?
Well, when the Flemings asked me to write the series, they had two criteria for me. One was to bring it into the 21st century on the page, so to modernize it, and the other was to widen out this cast of characters and bring in these new 00 heroes, which was so exciting, chance to create new characters, but also challenging, because if you have James Bond there, he really occupies the spotlight, and if he's there, as you say, that's who you want to look at, whether it's the page or the screen, and it's hard then to persuade a reader to look at another character. So I thought, well, then I need a way to get him to stand out of the spotlight so I can get my new characters into it. So my idea was to bake that challenge into the story itself. And from the beginning, James Bond is missing, possibly captured, possibly dead. MI6 don't know. And these new 00 heroes are trying to find him, as well as trying to avert a climate catastrophe. And that then, as you say, meant that I could make the most of the charge and power that he brings. And I think that link to Darth Vader is a really interesting one. And it's the same in something like Alien. You know, it's much scarier when you don't see it and your imagination is just running wild. And used sparingly, it's done to such great effect. Obviously, Bond isn't a scary alien, but I think the same thing applies, that used sparingly, his charge has a kind of electric spark to it, and you don't want to waste that. You don't want to drain that on incidentals, on things that don't matter. So whenever I bring him up, I did feel like it was a way almost of kind of plugging the book into the mains in that moment, and you want that charge, you want that shock, and you save it, and you do it when it's necessary and when it's important to the story and when it's important to the characters. So that was the hope from the beginning, the idea kind of behind having him missing, but having him, as you say, he's absent, but he's still present, because he's there in people's memories, he's there in flashback, in those really pivotal moments.
And I'm glad to see that was a thought process going in, because I know that using him sparingly, as you say, it had so much more of an impact for me as the reader, because I'm excited. I'm learning about these new characters. I'm getting excited about these new characters. And as time is going on and you start to develop that relationship, and you start to feel like you're connecting with them, you're like, okay, cool. And then you're reminded, oh, that's right, Bond. And it kind of comes full circle again, and you're like, that's right, that's why I'm reading this. Because at first it's a challenge, I'm sure, because for me, for the first couple of chapters, I was like, where are we going? But that's by design, and I understand that, because you do, like you said, you have to take Bond out of the spotlight to make room for these characters, and I think that's genius.
Oh, thank you. And I hoped that it would create also a kind of transference of sympathy for the reader, because as you say, you pick up a book that says James Bond on the cover, you read the first few chapters, he's not there. What's going on? But I tried to kind of, in how I arranged the characters that you meet and their relationship to him, have a sort of over time this transference of sympathy. So we have 003 Johanna Harwood, who's had a romantic relationship with him. We have 009 Sid Bashir, who he's mentored. We have Moneypenny, who is now head of the 00 section, who's kind of risen as a star through the department with him. And he cares about all of them, and they care about him and want to find him. So hopefully as the reader, you think, well, if James loves them, I'll give them a go, and then begin to kind of love them in their own right. So
let's go ahead and talk about the three main characters here. We've got Joanna Harwood, 003, of course, Joseph Dryden, 004, and Sid Bashir, 009. Now, those are your three main MI6 agents that this whole story kind of surrounds with. We sprinkle in, Moneypenny and Bill Tanner and Felix Leiter and all of the ancillary characters, as I refer to them, or the Scooby-Doo gang. They're always there. And, and I do love that, because they help kind of round out, and they bring that familiarity back into the fold to kind of help keep it grounded, kind of like Bond would. And he still does in this, which is great. Ken, that's why I kind of brought that up initially, was how you use it sparingly. It's so much more impactful. But I love the fact that you promoted Moneypenny to head of the 00 section now. That's an incredible jump in her character arc, coming from secretary to she's the boss. And I've heard you say it's time.
Yeah, the world's longest overdue promotion. I got a lot about Moneypenny's role, because I love Moneypenny in the books, but then also, of course, the films. So we have this role lasting for so many decades, and Lois Maxwell as well in that role across 3 actors worth of films. So really, Lois Maxwell is our longest serving Bond girl, if you want to put it that way. She's the longest serving kind of woman of Bond.
14 films.
Yeah, exactly. And because of that, I think she has a lot of authority. As audience members, we imbue her with a lot of trust, a lot of authority. It matters to us what she thinks. It matters to us if she's worried about Bond. It matters to us if she's happy, or if she's angry with him. And we always kind of savor those little scenes between them. And that goes back to this idea of charge. It's a great gift for a novelist to take on a franchise like this, because it comes pre-charged in certain areas. When you have a character like Moneypenny, where people are already imbuing her with all of those elements, use that. Don't just kind of relegate her to one scene here or there, but expand her role. So use that authority. She's now head of the 00 section. She's in charge of recruiting agents, and she and James have kind of grown up together almost, with her starting out as a runner in the field, and he is the agent she was running or attempting to run, because I can imagine he'd make that really hard. But they've had this long relationship with each other that really matters, and they have this very deep and intimate friendship. So that for me was so exciting, because it meant I could expand on her voice. I could get a little bit more into her mind. And then also I just always covet all of Lois Maxwell's clothes. So it also meant I could spend a long time pausing and zooming in and being like, what is that brooch? I want that brooch. And then describing it in a lot of detail.
eBay.
Yeah, exactly.
Are you brooch shopping again, Kim? No?
Never.
Oh, that's fantastic. So we talked about this briefly a moment ago, as far as like timeline, and coming off of famed author Anthony Horowitz and his trilogy, and what a trilogy that was.
Absolutely.
Where can our readers kind of see your trilogy going? Can you give us a spot in the novel timeline?
Yes. With my own head canon that's very personal and specific, so it might not make sense to other people, but I wanted to write Bond at around the age of 45, which is when Ian Fleming says 00s have to retire if they're not dead yet. There's an expectation that they will have already been killed, but if they've lived that long, they should retire and serve behind a desk. So Bond is around about that age when he goes missing at the start of Double or Nothing. And there's this kind of new generation of 00s, younger men and women who are sort of coming up the ranks behind him. And I wanted to situate that in dialogue with Ian Fleming's books. But of course, they're set in the 50s and 60s. So that's a challenge because I was trying to write a contemporary trilogy. So in my mind, I have my own headcanon versions of all of the Fleming novels that take place in the 90s, well, 80s, 90s, 2000s, sort of end of Cold War into war on terror, that then flow into Bond's missions. So he's still, in my mind, he's still done everything he did in the Fleming books. It's just it wasn't against Nazis just after the war in Moonraker. It was against neo-Nazis in Moonraker. Sadly, these things aren't that hard to shift along, because still dealing with these things. So that was my idea. So if people want a kind of sense of the backstory to my novels, go and read Fleming's novels, but obviously with a pinch of salt, because I've modernized it all in my mind. And I make little references in the book to his past missions, which people will recognize from the short stories or from the novels, with just a little bit of a twist.
So I know, like, when I read, and I think this is true for most people, because I've had this conversation with several people just throughout the community in general. When I read the Bond novels, certain authors typically will make me see a certain actor.
Oh, interesting.
Just I paint the picture. So all of the Fleming novels, all of the Raymond Benson novels, John Gardner, it's Sean Connery, 100%. I've never pictured anybody else. And I'm sorry for all the Roger Moore fans out there. I apologize. It's nothing against him personally, I promise. But the crazy thing was, for me, stepping into the Horowitz books and Double or Nothing, it's Craig.
Really?
I cannot not see Craig. And I think it's because he's been Bond for so long, and we've seen the start. We've seen that time arc now. Where this is the beginning of Bond. So whenever I read books like Casino Royale or Forever and a Day, it's Craig. It's always going to be Craig, because Connery was never that character.
Oh, that's so interesting.
So when my mind paints that picture,
and
I was going to ask you, who do you see when you're writing?
Well, for me, it often will depend on even, well, I was going to say on the scene, but even like the individual line of dialogue will shift who I'm imagining. And that's the amazing thing, I think, about this franchise, that you do have a Bond for every mood and every moment. So if I'm writing something where it's very kind of muscular and dynamic and action oriented, or that kind of very dry humor that Daniel Craig has, those two things he might come to mind. If it's Bond sort of stalking panther-like across a room, it's Sean Connery. For a smile, it's Pierce Brosnan, and so on and so on. So there's this kind of Rolodex of images. And then also even going back to the illustrations on the Pan paperbacks, and which were the first editions that I bought of Fleming's novels, and going back to some of the early comic strips, which really emphasize that kind of black comber of his hair. So there's this kind of visual collage, I think, that I'm working with when writing Bond, which always helps because it infuses the scene with that particular energy or flavor.
One of the things that I loved about Double or Nothing was the action scenes. And I don't want to compare you to someone, so I'm not going to, but I will say one of my favorite action scene authors, I feel like you picked up the pace right. You were just right there. And it was very cinematic in its style. Chapter 31, The Real Fight, that chapter is broken into these subsets to where it's, and I'm not really giving any story plots away when I say this, but there's like one paragraph and you're one place, and the next paragraph you're another place, and the next, and it's literally broken down like that to where it's telling you at the top above each paragraph, you're here, you're here, you're here. And I was like, that is such an incredible driving force. What challenges did you face with that approach while still considering the traditional reader's expectations going into this book?
Thank you. It's a really good question. No one's asked me about that yet, and I really enjoyed writing that chapter. So thank you.
Yeah.
So with that chapter, I guess I can say without giving too much away that it features this very high profile boxing match that's happening in this massive ring with a huge number of spectators, and then an illegal boxing match which is happening elsewhere with very few spectators, but which has huge stakes attached to it. I wanted to have that comparison. I did see it in cinematic terms. I thought if this was a film, you would cut back and forth between the high profile yet superficial one and the low profile high stakes one, and you would draw the parallel between the two, and the two do end up being linked in a particular way in the story. But I wanted that sense of kind of cut back and forth, and then it was a question of how do I represent that on the page to pull the reader along with me. So I wanted to bring in those kind of almost like in boxing when you think of kind of the rounds, or you think of the bell going, or the kind of the rhythm of the punches, there's a sense of frenetic change going on in boxing, and things can just switch like that. And so I felt like the form of the sport allows me to bring in these like very quick changes between settings, and also between kind of stakes, as I said. So then it was a matter of kind of visually representing it, and as you say, there's kind of location cues above each paragraph to draw the reader back and forth. And there's also kind of echoes of like particular punches thrown or particular things that the commentators are saying.
It's so well done.
Yeah, it was really fun to write that one. And I wanted to bring a game in, but I didn't want it to be, well, I don't know anything about golf for one thing, but I wanted it to be something that felt very, very muscular and could be a metaphor for being a 00. You know, Bond puts his body on the line, as do the other 00s, for his country. And there's something about boxing that I think particularly, it's about one's body in a very vulnerable way, and you have to be prepared to take the blows. You can't defend yourself. If you defend yourself, you'll never get an attack in and you'll lose. So you have to kind of get hurt to win, which I think is something that we see a lot in Bond and in the 00 section, as I have it in this book.
That's a great metaphor. I like that. You have to get hurt to win. I like that. You guys at home, seriously, that chapter blew, like, it at that point in the book, you're in. I mean, you're vested into the story, you're going to town, and you get to that chapter and it's like bing bang bing bang bing and you're like, oh my, whoa, okay. It's so fast-paced and exciting, and I absolutely loved it. So I'm glad to see you bring something fresh to the table like that, because it was, I loved, and again, I don't want to say other authors, but other authors that have written, there are similar action senses and styles that they bring in, but nothing was like that chapter, and I wanted to commend you for that. That was a really bold take to achieve such good emotion.
Oh, thank you.
Now, you've described Fleming's writing style as a rhythm of bullets, and then all of a sudden there's poetry. So that was a quote that you made about his style, and I thought that was brilliant. Speaking of poetry, there is a poem that you bring into this book. And can you kind of explain where this came from and why this element is so important in the novel?
Absolutely. Yeah. If you have it in front of you, if you want to fill people in.
Go where you will. I have no more to say. You have what I could give. Take it and go. I will not argue who 'twas struck the blow. The thing is broken. Throw the bits away.
So the context of the poem in the novel is that Bashir 009 is mentored by Bond, and one of the things that that Bond teaches Bashir is about number stations, which is how to communicate clandestinely. So if you've been undercover for a long time, or if you're emerging from capture and you need to get in touch with your home base, you can use or respond to what's known as your number station. And there's kind of obsessive corners of the internet that look out for these things. They're usually poems or nursery rhymes or snatches of song that appear mysteriously on the radio. So I was just really intrigued by this notion, and also this idea of how is an agent assigned a poem or a song for their their kind of way of getting in touch if they're in trouble, and what would it mean about them. So for Bashir's character, he has this fear around being broken in some way, that there's something wrong with him and his capacity to kind of emotionally attach to others. His background is he's a mathematician and a strategist. He has a very tactical mind, but he's also a philosopher, and he has a religious background. And his faith teaches him that to save one soul is to save all of humanity. So that places huge importance on just being able to save one person, on the importance of an individual life. But his kind of utilitarian philosophy and his strategic mind tells him that you should do whatever's best for the largest number of people, regardless of how it affects one person. And his arc in the novel is him kind of battling with these two positions and which one he believes. So when it came to assigning him this text, I chose a poem actually written by my great-grandfather, who was a poet, Sir J.C. Squire. And I chose this bit of his poetry because it taps into Bashir's fear. The thing is broken, throw the bits away. His fear about himself, that perhaps there's something in him that's fundamentally kind of divorced from humanity at large, that can't attach. Going back to his loss of his mother when he was young. But of course, it comes in a scene where it's assigned to him and it's Bond speaking to him. And I wanted to think as well about the mirror between these two men. Both of them have romantic relationships with 003, Johanna Harwood. And both of them are very different from each other. And yet she loves these two men. So what's similar about them? And I think one of the things that's similar about them is their perhaps struggle to attach to another human being, and their fear that there's something perhaps too broken in them to heal, and both of them going back to this childhood trauma. So I wanted to use that poem as a kind of mirror between the two. That's a long answer, but I'm really grateful to you for asking, because nobody's asked me about that yet.
No, it was something that really stood out in me to the book. Again, it was such a unique tactic to use. And hearing you say that it's something more commonplace and something that people kind of do look out for in the real spy world and just in media and things, that's even more grounded and more intriguing. So it's opened up more for that to me to be able to connect with. So I appreciate you answering that, because that's so much fun. But speaking of fun, we have to jump into, and I don't think it's a secret, I'm a pretty big car guy. I have a pretty good collection of cars over here.
You do.
We got to talk about the cars in this movie.
Yes.
Movie, listen to me. It's a book, and I'm comparing it to a movie. That's, guys at home, that's how cinematic her writing is. I felt like I was there. No, the cars in this novel were very unique. We're going to start off actually, because Bill Tanner's in the book. Yes. And he's one of the Scooby-Doo gang. He's there, he's doing his thing. And you put him in a vehicle, and it took me a second to figure out. I kind of had to look at Bill Tanner over the years, go back and look at some pictures and say, could I see Bill Tanner driving this? I'm going to go and throw a picture up here. It is a 1984 BMW E23 in brown. And I thought to myself, yep, that's Bill Tanner, all right. That is the dad mobile. That is what Bill Tanner would drive.
That's so funny. You say it's the dad mobile, because I picked that because I used to work as a childminder, and one of the dads whose kid I looked after had this car, and I just always looked at it and thought, this is just so fitting. He was a great dad, and he had just such a good dad energy, and he drove this car. So when I think of Tanner, I think of a kind of slightly rumpled, weary around the edges, well-meaning dad joke guy. So it seemed like the right car to me.
Oh, Tanner has all the dad jokes. Like, he wrote the book on dad jokes. Like, that is his character.
Yeah, exactly.
And to see him in this car, and the great thing is I know this guy. Yeah. Like, in real life, I know the man who would drive an 80s premium car and maintain it. It would be immaculate.
Yes,
They would
of
still
course.
have the, oh, it'd have the factory rims. He wouldn't even change the rims. It just had the factory, but they'd be immaculate.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. Yeah, and actually, there's a point in the book where they talk about taking the car to a garage. Probably for exactly that, just to really add a bit of spit and polish to the
Yeah,
rims.
exactly. Yeah, no, I thought that was very fitting. Now we step into someone else in the Scooby-Doo gang, which is Moneypenny, and she actually comes out swinging with something totally British
Yep.
and contemporary.
Yes.
And I love that you did this. And we actually talked about this because I had to clarify which vehicle this was. And again, we'll throw a picture up here, but it's the 1967 Jaguar E-Type Series 1. It's a 4.2. However, it's Moneypenny. She converted it to EV.
Yes. Yeah.
And you talk about that. So tell me about your influence on this one. Like, where did this one kind of form?
A lot of Moneypenny's things in the book, whether it's her outfits or her jewelry or the car that she drives, is essentially me coveting those things and hoping that someone wants to give them to me. I just really want this car. But I wanted to bring in, and you've completely captured it there, I wanted to bring in for Moneypenny something that is so kind of quintessentially British, but then give it this contemporary spin, because Moneypenny is part of our culture and our history here in how beloved she is in this franchise. So she is quintessentially British, but I'm also kind of modernizing her character and bringing a modern take on her in, as we were talking about earlier, imbuing her with authority, promoting her to the head of the 00 section. So I wanted to take something very classic and then give it that contemporary twist. And I felt like, especially as this book deals with the climate crisis, yes, I want to have beautiful cars in the book, but there's also a tension there between writing about the climate crisis and everybody, joyriding in their lovely cars.
Right.
And I felt like Moneypenny, maybe on a government salary it would be hard, but she has Q branch, so she can have the beautiful Jaguar and turn it into an electric vehicle.
And the crazy thing is, they actually, and I'm going to show pictures here as well, they're in the process of making this car.
That's right.
There's a prototype, and I sent you images of those as well, where the engine actually does 0 to 60 in 5.5 seconds. Oh, talk about throw you in the back.
Right. I mean, they probably need an ambassador, and I think it probably should be me.
I think it should.
Putting it out there.
I've seen you pose with some cars, and I think
we've
got the spokesperson.
I can't actually drive. That's the one flaw here, but
you make sure your pants don't have any buttons on them, because if you scratch it, it's a $300,000 car.
Yes,
that's a very good
point. That's a very good point. Every time they bring, my terrible confession is that I don't know how to drive, but every time they bring the Alpine to one of my events, and we pretend I've driven it there, and I'm leaning against it as if it's my vehicle, I am always thinking, like, there's zips on this dress. Like, this is a very expensive paint job.
Well, and speaking of which, that brings us to Joanna Hardwood's 003, her car. And I tell you what, guys, look at this beautiful piece of machinery. And I mean, we're talking about, what is it, a 2019?
I think 2019, yeah.
Okay, so 2019 Alpine A110 S model. There is a GT model as well, but you went with the S model. And this one is actually in Thunder Gray. And now I imagined it with the blacked out rims, because I just thought that would
be good.
I'm just going to say it. I thought it looked sexy as hell.
I don't think I specify, so I'll throw that in the next book.
For car guys, we like these little details.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell me about this vehicle, because we get, and I don't want to spoil anything for people at home, because guys, there's gadgets. I'm not going to talk about them, but where did the inspiration for this one come from? I mean, is this also something that you're just like, I want to be the spokesperson for this car too, or was there something more?
So this came from the easiest editorial note in the world. The head of the Fleming estate collects Alpine cars and said to me, can 003 drive an Alpine? So, of course, I said yes. And then I said, the only thing is, for my creative process, it will be essential that a race car driver takes me out in the Alpine so that I can write about it properly. So they brought the car up to Edinburgh, but at this point it was still a secret. I couldn't tell anybody what I was doing, and it wasn't public or anything. So they told the Alpine team who were there, they were doing this tour with the car, and they were told that I was a VIP. So I went along pretending to be a VIP of God knows what. So we were chatting away and talking about cars, and he said, "What do you drive?" And I said, "Oh, I don't actually drive." And so thank you for taking me out. And driving around the city. And then he said a little while later, "What do you do?" And I thought, well, I need to come up with the reason I'm here. And I was taking notes as well in the car of like the sound of the engine and the feel of the seats, which isn't probably what most people do on a test drive. So I thought I also need to explain that. So my cover story I came up with was, "Oh, I'm a writer and I'm writing a book about cars." And then he turned to me and said, "But you told me you can't drive." Like, yes, it's a highly limited book about cars. It's about cars nonetheless. So then I just completely pivoted, and I spent the next 15 minutes talking about the Fast and Furious franchise in an effort to throw up a smoke screen. So I think he left thinking, that woman is weirdly obsessed with Vin Diesel. So I just like rabbited on. So it was very nice when I could call him up and say, "I'm writing James Bond, thanks for taking me out in the car." And the gadgets were so fun to develop because I got to speak with the head of Alpine, and who's a massive Bond fan. And I said to him, just talk me through the specs of the car and the design process. And he was so generous with his time. And one of the things that he told me that completely caught my imagination was that in the Alpine, there are these 5 buttons, and he taught me through what they all do. And then he got to this point and he said, so the 4th one does this. And then he said, but the 5th one doesn't actually do anything at all. We designed it that way because it's aesthetically pleasing. And then we had no function for it, but we left it there because it looks right. So, immediately for me, I'm like, a button that does nothing. Hang on, let me step in here.
Right. I have ideas, let's talk.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So that was really fun. Just kind of augmenting it and thinking through what would Q Branch do, with this very beautiful vehicle if they had their hands on it.
We've seen an Alpine in Dr. No, and I am surprised that, especially with the love of the Fleming, estate, collecting them, how they have not made their way back into the franchise. Now, and I know there's a contract with Aston and Ford for a while. There was a contract, and I get that contracts exist for reasons. It saves everybody money and makes everybody money and blah blah blah. But you would think, we made the pivot, to BMW.
Yes,
we made the pivot to Lotus.
Yes.
I think you're right. I think it's time for an Alpine to come back into the movie franchise, because guys, I mean, look at the interior of this. I mean, we're talking Alcantara, carbon fiber, push button start, gorgeous touch screen, and you've got an ejector button or a gadget button or a flamethrower, whatever you want to put on your car. You've got a button that's just waiting.
Exactly, it's just waiting. And it was I thought a lot about the kind of the history of Alpine and the cars, and because if you're going to bring in a new vehicle and kind of make a bit of a statement and say this is the new, in my world, this is the new 00 vehicle, you want it to be for a reason. So Johanna Harwood's background is that she's Northern Irish on her father's side, and on her mother's side she's French of Algerian descent, and her mother has a kind of vintage Alpine of around like the Dr. No vintage, that Harwood grows up riding around in with her mum, and she has a fairly complex relationship with her mother that's kind of drawn out through this description of the car in one of the kind of key scenes of the book, because that's also, I think, the other thing about chase scenes. Like, chase scenes are so fun to write, but there's an additional challenge when you're doing a chase scene in prose as opposed to the screen, because on the screen you've got edits, you've got music, you've got all of these other things to work with. On the page, there's a limit to how many times you can describe someone moving a steering wheel. So you think about layers then. So with the chase scenes in the book, I always thought about the kind of the layer of what the cars are doing, the layer of the geography, the layer of the characters' motivations, the layer of the characters' sort of subconscious being played out through this scene. So you've got these kind of it's almost like sort of topography mapped on top of each other, all the different layers in the story and the character and the setting and the car itself, which you're then trying to bring together in the chase scene.
Oh, and it was beautiful. I love the scenery that you painted, basically putting this in winter, which I'm a huge fan of, because and they even talk about it, and this is set at Christmas time.
Yeah,
correct?
yeah, that's right. So
And
just before Christmas, yeah.
that's one of my favorite things because I'm a huge Christmas fan.
Oh,
Um, if you have time, there's a few videos of me in a Santa Claus suit on my channel.
watching immediately.
But we haven't had a dedicated Bond Christmas story really in a while. And
Yeah.
one of my favorites, of course, is On Her Majesty's, Secret Service. But Double or Nothing really brought a lot of key elements together. There is a huge cast here, huge, and I do love that. And kind of how you said, with this book being the first of a trilogy, where 007 is kind of sidestepped. We're moving Bond aside and out of the way. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of emotional elements that kind of pull and push back and forth. It's a lot of give and take with that. You've reintroduced the audience, if you will, to a homosexual character, within the book franchise. And for those of you at home that are saying, well, who are you talking about? First off, you should read your books. But secondly, it's Pussy Galore. Because Pussy Galore was a lesbian who Bond was able to magically seduce. But this was a first time, really, that we have a male, gay, black, deaf lead character. And Joseph Dryden 004, he is that character. And he gets some really cool elements that I don't want to spoil for everybody. But can you describe how writing this character into life felt that now was the time?
Yeah, absolutely. So Dryden's character, the seed for his character, I was looking at the pathways that people take to becoming spies. And one of the most common here, and I imagine elsewhere as well, is soldiers who were in special forces and they sustain some kind of injury that means that they are medically downgraded and they can no longer serve on the front line. But of course, they have this huge wealth of experience, hundreds of individual missions, multiple tours of duty, and they have this sort of vast skill set that governments have invested a lot of money in. And you don't just want to kind of let that go if you're an intelligence agency. So a lot of these former soldiers will be recruited as spies. So when I learned that, I got really interested in this idea of somebody who is a warrior, who's always had to rely on their body as a special forces soldier, who's been able to trust their body. And then he sustains this injury that damages his auditory processing nerve, and it impacts on his hearing and the way he understands speech. So suddenly he goes from having always been able to rely on his body to his body no longer being or no longer feeling under his control. And that brings him to the attention of Moneypenny and Q Branch, who have technology that can kind of address or even augment some of these issues. So that's how he comes to their attention as a 00. So then I began to think
cool element.
Thank you. So then I began to think about his backstory as a special forces soldier and how I could bring that into the present day, because that seemed like a cool background to really get the most out of for the character. And actually, I started to think a lot about Tomorrow Never Dies, which is one of my favorites, and particularly for the scene where Terry Hatcher. See, we're in sync.
Oh.
So the scene where Terry Hatcher, turns up and she slaps him and everything, and do you still sleep with a gun beneath your pillow? I love that history. And again, going back to this idea of charge, if you've got a former romantic relationship that you can bring into the present, it comes pre-charged. It comes with conflict. And conflict is the engine for story. So that's what you're always searching for as a writer. So I thought, what if Dryden had been in love with his second in command in the army, and then they both leave the army and they go on these very different trajectories. Dryden becomes a 00, his second in command, and his partner, Luke Luck, or as he's known, Lucky Luke, his life really falls apart when he leaves the army, which of course happens for a lot of veterans, suffers from PTSD, suffers from addiction, and he is swept up by this very persuasive personality, a tech billionaire, Sir Bertram Paradise, who claims he can solve the climate crisis. And Moneypenny wants to know if he's quite so saintly as he seems. So Dryden and Luke are brought back together again, Luke now serving as bodyguard to Bertram Paradise, Dryden as a 00 investigating Paradise. So then you have this great conflict on the page between these two who've never stopped loving each other, but they have gone in these kind of polar opposite directions. And that, for me, that relationship, that kind of tug between them was one of the most rewarding aspects of the book to write, because they're two people who are incredibly tough and yet vulnerable, and they share that vulnerability with each other. And that's one of the most kind of crunchy and rich things to write, I think.
So what about that relationship, and why now?
That's a good question. I mean, I think partly it's, when you compare the age I'm writing in to, say, Ian Fleming's age, I'm essentially of my time. So why not now? Because it's the world I grew up in. It to me, it only makes sense. As I'm sure to Ian Fleming and to writers before me, the choices they made only made sense because it was the worlds they were writing in. And I thought a lot about, I've got this opportunity to expand the 00 cast. Who am I going to bring in? And the first thing I did was take a look at the MI6 website, where you can see like the job adverts for who they're recruiting. And they're really funny because they're things like, do you speak multiple languages? Do you like to travel? Do you have loose morals? Maybe you think a good spy. But they really emphasize that they're looking for diversity. And of course, it only makes sense. If every spy in the 00 section looked like James Bond, there'd be an extreme limit to the number of undercover missions they could take on. And of course, Bond is just constantly telling people who he is anyway. But I wanted to kind of lean into that and think, well, if the real life MI6 is as diverse as the world around me is, the world I've grown up in, then I want to put that in the book, and to hopefully make this an inclusive kind of chapter in the Bond story. When I grew up, and like we were talking earlier about, I loved Bond as a kid, and I would play these imaginary games where I was Bond. I was playing as Bond. I wasn't playing as a Bond girl. And that's no insult to Bond girls. There are some amazing female characters in the Bond canon. But I wanted to play as the hero. I didn't want to be rescued. I wanted to do the rescuing. So I'm hoping that by bringing in Johanna Harwood, bringing in Sid Bashir, bringing in Joseph Dryden, I'm maybe opening the door to more people to kind of imagine themselves as the hero and to become Bond fans.
And I think you hit the nail on the head. Really, why not? We've got plenty of stories with a vanilla cast.
Right.
It's time to start opening up to the fact that here we have a globe-trotting group. Right. It is a group. It's the 00 section. It's the 00 department. It's not the 00 agent singular.
Right. Exactly.
They would speak multiple languages. They would be from different ethnicities. They would be different genders. And I feel like this was such an inclusive book that handled a topic that I know has been controversial. I know it has. I've heard people in the community, unfortunately, that have told me they will not read this book because they found out certain things. And you know what? That is their loss, because they are missing out on something truly engaging and something that really does add to the universe. And we have to be open and open-minded moving forward into this franchise, because it makes everyone inclusive. We don't have to turn 007 into a girl, but it doesn't mean there's not a girl or a woman out there who's just as capable of pulling it off. And you did a great job with Joanna Harwood on this. You really did.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's really nice to hear. And of course, you're never going to please everybody, and that's totally fine. And not everyone will want to come along with you. But I think what you've said there is really how I felt, that I didn't want to change Bond's character. I've been a fan of Bond all of my life. I don't want him to change. And to me, one of the most exciting things about this project is that I get to write James Bond. So I don't want to mess with him. I just want to have fun writing him. And I want to think about, who is he today? How do you make Fleming's Bond? How do you make the Bond we've seen evolve through the films convincing and rounded today? So that was one of the great opportunities of the book. And then if you're keeping Bond as Bond, but you can bring in these new 00 characters, that to me is an opportunity to create original female heroes, to create original diverse heroes, because to me the idea of almost mapping a female hero onto the template of a male hero, which is what it would mean in some ways to say, oh, James Bond is a woman now, then you're kind of contorting yourself to fit a female character onto a male template. And
yeah, that's
that
shoehorn.
to me it says that there isn't a story you could tell about a female hero that is original and compelling, where that character is just as competent, interesting, rounded, complex, deep, human, funny, brave, smart, vulnerable, all of the things that male characters get to be, and female characters often don't because they're relegated into smaller roles. Let's tell some original stories. Let's create some new heroes. That was what was exciting for me.
And you kept it in the franchise, and that's the joy of this, because there are movies out there that I have enjoyed for years. Atomic Blonde, Anna, was Red Sparrow. These are all spy films with lead female actresses that one could argue is sharing the same world as Bond.
Sure.
But it's not him, and it's not the official Ian Fleming franchise.
Right.
So we're never going to see a crossover. We're never going to see that character come in to a Bond film and do a cameo or something, or in a book. And that's unfortunate, because those stories, that would be so much fun to see a crossover of something of that magnitude. But that's what you have created with this, is something where we all were like, we need something else in this franchise. I don't think anybody knew exactly what it was. And I gotta say, I think this was it. I think this element of characters, this diverse group of people, it just opens the floodgates now of side mission after side mission, with cameo after cameo. And let's just be honest. I mean, I'm assuming you have seen No Time to Die. Okay. So No Time to Die, you ask most people, what is their favorite part about No Time to Die? And they will tell you Paloma.
Yes. I mean, God, what a character introduction, right?
And that whole
absolutely amazing.
thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the freedom of an original character, because they can just barnstorm in. And there's always been form for this within the world of Bond. So when you go back to Fleming's books, he writes some amazing female characters. When you look at a character like Gala Brand, who's undercover as a police officer on her own mission when Bond joins her, or Tiffany Case, who's a diamond smuggler, who again has her own agency and her own motives when Bond comes into her life. I think that was really important to Ian Fleming in a way that perhaps wasn't as important to, some other writers in the genre. When you look at his era, they often have much smaller roles for female characters, if they're there at all. And they can be maybe more reserved as a sort of reward for the hero at the end of the story. Whereas Ian Fleming, I think, was very invested in making these characters feel real on the page. And we've seen that in some of these amazing iterations that we've had on the screen as well, of brilliant female characters played by iconic actresses. And speaking of yesterday, as we're talking, Michelle Yeoh won her Oscar. Yes, come on. So we've had these amazing talents in this world, and I remember when Michelle Yeoh appeared in Bond, and all of us were saying, can she have her own film, or can she come back, please? There was that real hunger.
There was talks about that. Her and Halle Berry were supposed to get a spin-off, and they didn't.
And I think there's always been that appetite. There's always been, or from my perspective anyway, appetite to know who else is in the 00 section. As you know, it's not just Bond. They can't always be on holiday, the other 00s. Like, what are they up to? So answering that question is fun. But also an appetite for characters who are a little bit different from Bond, but can stand alongside him, and to see that interaction. We love it when we get to see it in small bite sizes, with the sort of allies he picks up on his missions. And this is a chance to go deeper with it.
It does. It does. It opens up the doors. And, the spy stories in general, They're a lot like onions. And in the words of the illustrious Benoit Blanc, you know, there's another layer and another layer and another layer.
I thought you were going to do Shrek. Ogres are like onions.
And, you know, so, but the lies and the compartmentalizing of relationships that these people in the real spy world have to do in order to just kind of justify their actions, really,
Right.
you know, including things like mirroring and interrogations. Can you tell me about the psychology or the art of manipulation going into the design of Joanna Hardwood specifically? Because she has a very special set of skills that we see unfold. And I don't want to go too far into it. I don't want to give something up, but her lifestyle and her character was so much richer than I ever imagined it could be. So yeah, can you tell me about, you know, what went into that?
Absolutely. So when I began to think about Harwood's character, I was really interested in this idea of having a license to kill and what that means, because it sounds kind of sexy and glamorous on the surface, but when you think about it, it's an enormous ethical burden and responsibility to have the power to decide if somebody lives or dies, just yourself individually, and you don't have to report to anybody. A jury doesn't have to be involved. You are the last word. So who does that appeal to? And what does it take? What does it take from you? What's the cost to assume that responsibility? So as I was thinking about that, I began to wonder, what is the opposite of a license to kill? And I thought it's the Hippocratic Oath. It's the doctor's vow to heal anybody, no matter who they are, what they've done, or whose side they're on. So then I began to think, what would it take for a character to go from the Hippocratic Oath to a license to kill? And that was where 003 Harwood's character was born. So she starts off life training as a trauma surgeon, and then something happens which brings her to Moneypenny's attention, and she becomes a 00, and she assumes this responsibility of the license to kill. And for somebody to be able to make that move, they have to have a psychological depth and complexity. They have to be multifaceted in order to be able to hold so many facets. And that's a great gift if you've got a character who can do that as a spy. And that was one of the kind of most fun things to write, because she's very interested in the inner mechanics of people, you know, both as a surgeon and as somebody with her own kind of complex depth. And that plays out in her missions, and it plays out in her relationship with Bashir and with Bond as well. So that was a lot of fun to write.
So much fun. I tell you, the whole chapter where her and Felix hook up.
I love writing Felix so much.
And the crazy part is I'm reading it and I'm going, there's more to this, but I don't know what. And then later on it's explained, and it was like, loved it.
Thank you.
Okay, so bonus question. With you having the trilogy on the mantle, okay, you're tasked to go ahead and give us 2 more books. Can you answer one question about the future books?
Can try. I mean, I can feel the Flemings going, no, you can't.
They're like standing over you with like a fly swatter. Stop it. Don't do that. I really hope to see that we get a cameo. And I mentioned this earlier. Do we get a cameo from Paloma?
Oh, wow. I mean, for that we'd have to get into some massive contracts, and I mean, as you'll know, the Broccolis and the Flemings, you know, run the films and the books separately. So there's you know, giving each other creative space. But I can say that you're absolutely right that when she appeared on the screen, I remember in the cinema. So my cinematic experience with No Time to Die was kind of surreal, because they throw a premiere just for the Fleming family, and the Fleming family bring along their writers. So I went to see it with the Flemings, which is a very weird way to watch Bond. If you haven't seen No Time to Die, pause to watch him die with the Flemings. It was very surreal. But I remember when she came on screen, there was this kind of sense in the audience, this energy, kind of excitement, and then the same, and even more so probably because there wasn't this family sense of holding your breath when I went to see it just, in a regular cinema, this current of excitement of, she's cool, who is this character? And I really felt it too, and I really felt like, yeah, that's an energy this world needs. And so I can't steal Barbara Broccoli's characters, but I can say that it's an energy that resonates with me, and that I've thought about, how to capture in the books and in new characters.
I wasn't sure if that was something that was able to cross over or not. I know that can be tricky. You're right. There's contracts and there's licensing and there's copyrights and lawyers and red tape and yeah, I get it. Okay.
Exactly. But I mean, what a character. If I ever had the chance, amazing. Yeah.
So guys, be sure to pick up your copy, Double or Nothing. Kim, let us know, where can everybody get this? Tell me where we can find you.
All bookstores and online, of course. So you'll find it on Amazon and all places you shop online. But I always say shop local, shop independent. You'll find it in your local store. And you can follow along with my adventures. I'm now just finishing up editing book 2 in the series. And you can read about that and more in my newsletter, Girl with the Golden Pen, on Substack. Can you tell us anything? I got to ask because I got you here. So I have to ask. Can you tell us anything about the new book? What can I tell you? I guess I can tell you that while each book is standalone and discrete, so if people just happen to pick up book 2 first, that's fine. I've conceived it as a trilogy. So there are threads that are left running at the end of Double or Nothing that you will find again in book 2. So they're very much kind of flowing into each other. And some, hopefully, the elements that you've enjoyed in the book will be there again. And then I'm also trying to do something a little bit new. I've been thinking about the idea of kind of a second installment, and I'm thinking about like Empire Strikes Back, X2, things that kind of go a bit deeper and darker. Because you've done your setup, like that's over and done with, so you can get into it all a little bit more. So they are linked story wise, but it will also feel a little bit different tonally. And I feel like when it comes to books, the sophomore book is so much more like, let's go. Because like you said, the setup is there. The tone is laid. Now we can just get into the nitty gritty. There's not so much descriptive and like introducing this person and that person and so on and so forth. So you've kind of got to know it all. And that's true for me as a writer. I've now spent however many years now, quite a long time with these characters, and so it's a joy to kind of get to go into these deeper layers with them. Well, I am definitely so happy to have you today. Thank you so much for taking time to spend with me and my audience. This has been such a blessing. Is there anything else, any closing statements you have about Double or Nothing? Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's been such a lovely conversation, and so nice to talk to somebody, who's just so richly immersed in this world. And yeah, I hope people enjoy it. I've tried to, as we've talked about, I've tried to honor Ian Fleming's vision and all of the things that we love about Bond, while also hopefully bringing a fresh take and spin that will invite more people into the world, as well as kind of speak to existing fans like us. So I hope that if you're new to Bond, you really enjoy it and you go and you watch more Bond and read Ian Fleming. And if you're a Bond diehard fan, there's lots here for you as well. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, Merry Christmas, 007.